Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part two of my second interview with Greg Prince, author of Leonard, Arrington, and the Writing of Mormon History, also the author of David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, and another book that we'll talk about regarding the priesthood restoration. In part one, we talked about Greg's childhood growing up in LA area. We talked about him falling in love with science and going to dental school and eventually getting a PhD in immunology.
Pathology. Close enough.
Pathology. And eventually how he worked in Maryland with the NIH and others to develop a cure for RSV, a fatal respiratory illness in infants. And it was a fascinating story and something that people don't know about Greg. So in this part, we're going to turn to sort of how he got interested in writing Mormon history, and also we're going to talk about his book before we, in part three, talk about where the church is today. Before we jump into all that, why don't you talk briefly, let's see, do we talk about your son now, or do we wait and talk about that after we talk about your Mormon history writings? Do you have a preference?
Your choice.
Let's talk about him now.
All right. We have three children. The youngest is a boy, Madison. He's 26. About, I would say, months after he was born, we noticed that he wasn't developing the way that the others had developed, but we didn't know if that was alarming yet. My two partners in the biotech company were both pediatricians. One was the chair of pediatrics at the military medical school. They didn't see that anything was wrong, so, okay, we're fine. We'll quit worrying about it. But by the time he was 2, it was clear that the speech was not developing, and then we started to get really concerned. Now, he was born in 1989. The state of the art in diagnosing autism was pretty minimal then. We took him for tests to Children's Hospital in DC, which is a very, very good children's hospital. And at the age of 3, they said, well, he's not developing normally, but we don't really know what it is. And so they gave it an awful label called pervasive developmental disorder, which is jargon for something's wrong, but we don't know what it is. Yeah. And that's not very helpful to parents.
No.
But at least it gave us enough of an indicator that we got him into special education by the time he was 3.5. He was getting on a school bus every morning and going to a special ed program. It was when he was about 6.5 that they finally put the dagger to the heart and said, your child has autism. I barely knew what the word meant at that point. That's not a message that any parent wants to hear, but it's a message that's being heard more and more commonly now. If you go back about 30 years, the recognized incidence was about 1 in 2,500 births. Now it's 1 in 68, which means that it's more prevalent than all of the other congenital disorders put together, by far. And it is creating really a national public health disaster that we have not been able to respond to yet. So as we have tried to figure out what's the course of life for Madison, we've become aware that we're not alone in this, but that what we're trying to do, we are alone in. There was not a single organization in the country that was addressing the issues of autistic adults. Autism Speaks is the big one in the country. They raise a lot of money, they do a lot of research. It's not going towards adults. Jolynn, my wife, is affiliated with a government committee. It's called IAC, Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. It's chaired by the National Institutes of Health, but it has other government components that have a piece of autism within their portfolio. just a week ago, they issued an internal report that in the most current or the most recent reporting year, between federal and private dollars spent for autism research, $308 million were handed out. 1% went to adult autism. And yet eventually 3/4 of the autistic people in this country will be adults. They have a normal lifespan, and so they're going to live to their 80s. And right now, there's nothing out there for them.
Talk about what it was like with Madison growing up. Try and convey in a minute or two the difficulties of raising an autistic child.
It's hard to
through stories
to convey verbally how taxing it is on all fronts. He is low functioning. He has very limited verbal skills, and this is part of his.
What words can he say?
Well, he could.
Or as a child, what words?
No, he has a vocabulary, but he won't. Either can't or won't carry on a conversation, and most of his sentences will be very simple structure of objects or subject, verb, object.
Give us some examples.
Very few adjectives, very few adverbs. One of the hallmarks of autism is everything is concrete, everything is literal. So any notion of being able to capture emotions, being able to describe feelings, being able to talk about thoughts, it's almost impossible for somebody who is on the autism spectrum. And then there are behavioral issues, some of which come directly from frustrations. He knows that he can't communicate well, and it's both a receptive and an expressive communication deficit. There's lack of abstract thinking, there's repetitive behavior, there are behavioral outbursts, and as they get into puberty, these tend to get magnified. You can have aggression, you can have anxiety issues, depression, and to this day there's not a single drug that goes to the core of what autism is. Everything that's used is to treat these nagging symptoms. Eating disorders, sleeping disorders, aggression, depression, anxiety, and most of those drugs have dreadful side effects. One of the most difficult being a lot of weight gain. But they're the only tools in the arsenal right now. So we have not only had to try to figure out how can we have him live with us in a safe environment that's safe for him and for us, how do we negotiate that with his older siblings? And what's out there after he turns 21? Because at age 21, your support from the government disappears. Until the age of 21, children with disabilities by federal law are in the care of the school systems. And they are required to give what supposedly is optimum setting for whatever that disability is. That varies in terms of how it's actually carried out. But when they turn 21, they drop off the cliff.
So just to kind of bring it maybe to a slightly personal level, talk us about a story or two to illustrate the difficulty of raising an autistic kid that you and Jillian may have had to deal with.
He used to have severe sleep disorders. He would be bouncing around until sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning. And then within a few seconds, he'd fall asleep, but we wouldn't, because we can't sleep through that bouncing around. And there were a couple of years there when I still had the dental practice. I would see my first patient at 7 a.m. So if I wasn't getting sleep until 3 and then I had to get up at 6, that's not a good way to live life. We finally found that a very simple remedy existed, at least for him. It's called melatonin. We were using some artillery. Again, both of my business partners were pediatricians, and we were using some fairly heavy drugs at times just to try to knock him out, but he would become refractory to those within days. You can't go down that road very far. And then somebody suggested try melatonin. So for a tablet that probably cost 3 or 4 cents, we got our lives back. That he would then go into just a natural glide into sleep and would more or less sleep through the rest of the night. So that was a huge difficulty. When he was probably 6, 7, around there, he didn't have the vocabulary to express much of anything. one thing that we were sure that he enjoyed was little stuffed animals. So people would give him these as gifts all the time. And he had a small mountain of these. Occasionally, he wouldn't be able to find one. And he would remember which one it was. But he couldn't tell us. He couldn't articulate that. And he would erupt into a full-blown tantrum that would go on for hours and just about wear us out. Sometimes he finally just wore down enough that it became a non-issue, but most of the times we had to scour the house and finally find that one little stuffed animal that he was looking for. And that was an ongoing thing. Autism is a 24/7 dilemma for families.
What about in adolescence? What's it like as it advances to adolescence? What were some of the difficulties?
Yeah, you can't generalize. That's one of the real difficulties with autism. People talk about autism spectrum. I've used that term. But that's a misnomer, because if I say to you spectrum, you very likely will have a visual image of the spectrum of visible light, that it goes from red on this end to purple on the other end. That's not autism. It's an array. It's multidimensional, and you have perhaps certain clusters within that array that would be more populated than others, but every individual is going to be different. There are certain hallmark characteristics of autism, but then everything else is negotiable. So some would go through adolescence and be fairly passive. Madison became more active, more aggressive, and it's just a continual battle to try to figure out how are we going to manage, not just today, but the moving target that this is. And this is common for all parents who are dealing with autistic children.
So by adolescence, was he able to read? Was reading just not?
He can read. He can read out loud and do pretty well, but it's very difficult to assess how much retention.
He can read words?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he can't put a sentence together?
He can put a sentence, but it won't be a complex sentence.
Give me an example of a sentence.
And he won't, I want a glass of water.
So he would say a full sentence?
He can say that, yeah.
Okay.
But he won't carry on a conversation with you. But the real nightmare for us, in addition to just trying to live to the next day, is what happens when he drops off the edge of that cliff. What are the services that are going to make his life dignified and meaningful?
What cliff?
Age 21.
The financial services that are...
The school. When he gets out of school, there's nothing there. The federal mandate ends.
And so he was in school up to 21.
That's when he was in middle school, it came crashing down on us, as we later found out it does on all parents, at about that same time, that whatever conditions are now, when he hits 21, those disappear. And so we decided that we would try to make a bit of a difference in the world, and rather than just wrapping all of our resources around Madison, try to make a difference in a more global setting and address the issues of autistic adults. There was not a single organization in the country at that time that did that. And there still isn't. I don't think there's any other that focuses solely on the lifespan issues of autistic adults, and that's what we're trying to do.
Did you ever get the sense that there was more in there that he was able?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Was that what the frustration was about?
I think that's part of his frustration, but you're guessing because he can't articulate it clearly. On rare occasions, something minor may happen and he'll suddenly sob.
Sob?
Sob. It's very rare, but when that happens, it just tears my heart out. And I think that's when he becomes more acutely aware of what a disadvantage he has in the world, but he doesn't have any way of rectifying that. I think that's what's going on there. But in a way, being a parent of an autistic child is like being a veterinarian. You're dealing with a patient who can't give you the feedback, and you just try to do the best that you can. But it wears people out. It destroys marriages. It wrecks sibling relationships. I suppose that there are some who would say this is a blessing. I'd be happy to sit down and compare notes with them. because it can be so destructive on such a broad front that you really have to wonder, what are the answers to those questions? But we don't have those answers. And so you deal with today and you hope that you got enough energy and resources tomorrow. And then you really hope that by the time that child becomes an adult, there's something out there that will give some meaning, some dignity to life, some relief for the parents. And then the ultimate nightmare for all parents is, what about when I'm not capable of caring for this child anymore, or when I'm gone? And you don't want a sudden transition from having that child perhaps still living with you to being institutionalized. That's the ultimate nightmare. And
so
we don't have good answers.
Well, he wouldn't know the difference. He's not fully in there.
Oh, he would know the difference.
He would.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that must be...
He's a bright young man, and we can see glimpses of it. He has some amazing artistic talents, and we're trying to help him develop those, not only for his own satisfaction, but potentially to help bring in a livelihood for him eventually.
Like drawing or painting?
Yes,
or
both.
What?
Both.
So what types of things can he draw or paint?
He does some that are concrete images. He'll draw animals quite a bit, but it's his kind of animal. Sometimes it'll be abstract things. We're working now with a brilliant artist and entrepreneur who sees great potential in what Madison is producing. He says, we can commercialize this because he is into something here. He's hitting on a note artistically that I haven't seen before. But that's Madison, and the next person down the bench may have a completely different skill set. One of the things that is very clear is that for all of the resources that are put into special education, all of the IEPs, you know that term, individualized educational program, that's required by law for all children with disabilities, when they age out of the school system, where does that go? Most of them become unemployed. And so one of the things that we're trying to start to figure out, and I had discussion this morning with Matt Holland down at UVU, because I'm on his presidential advisory board, and he said, yeah, we're with you 100% on this, to try to figure out what kind of assessment tools could we develop so that we can sit down with one individual and say, what are the core strengths, the core weaknesses, what's the potential for getting this one person into a situation of lifetime employment? Because it's not going to work with a one-size-fits-all. But what's being done now isn't working. The unemployment and underemployment rate for autistic adults is over 80%. We're not getting the job done. And we don't just want to have these people sitting in front of a TV for the rest of their lives. That's violent to them, it's violent to society. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to figure out.
With Madisonhouse?
With Madisonhouse, yep. Madisonhouse Autism Foundation. And we are trying to work on innovations that can be deployed nationally, maybe even globally. There's just so much that needs to be done. We need a housing model. 75%, it's a guess, but it's the best number that we have, of autistic adults are living with aging parents, with no prospect of any place to go when those parents die. That's a horrible situation, and yet we don't even have any answers on paper, much less deployable answers. So we've got the rest of our lives booked up already just trying to figure these things out.
I've talked to you about maybe having Jolynn back on and doing a series on autism within kind of a Mormon context. So let's put a pin in that and maybe follow up.
Then you'd get it right.
Yeah, yeah. So Jolynn, we're coming after you.
I'm just the clumsy spokesman. I'm the dad, and men aren't worth much.
So I want to kind of branch into your Mormon sort of history career. I'm wondering, just really briefly, what's it like to be trying to develop a cure for an illness for a bunch of other people's children when your own son is struggling with a really significant condition. Was that emotionally difficult or taxing for you? Did you even tie those two together? Was that frustrating? Was it hard?
No, because the important developmental work on the drug was done before we had the diagnosis of Madison.
Okay.
Life was difficult just because of all of the challenges that he brought into our lives. And I will say, our other two kids are amazing. For all of the sacrifices that they had to make along the way for having an autistic brother, they were magnificent. And I think it goes a long way towards what they are now. Our daughter now works, as of about 3 months ago, for a relatively new news organization called Vice News. The millennials know all about it. The old folks say, what's that? But she spent the 3 years prior to that working at NBC in New York. She was hired to be on Ann Curry's production team of 7 people. She was the only one who had no broadcast experience. She was 15 years younger than the next youngest. And I talked to Ann at one point. Ann came down for Lauren's wedding, which is really cool. But she said, Lauren didn't have the qualifications. And she said, no, but when I talked to her, and she was talking about her brother. But it can go the other way, too. That it can destroy sibling relationships and can destroy marriages. We were fortunate on that account that it became a major piece of the character that Madison's 2 siblings eventually developed. And I don't think there's any shortcut to get that. I can put Lauren, particularly with her broadcast experience, in any situation among any group of people, she will thrive. And it's because she's got that grounding. She's got a sense, a moral compass that is almost unparalleled in any age that I have seen. And it goes right back to her relationship with Madison.
What about your other child?
Chad went into a different arena. He's trying to get a foothold in filmmaking in Southern California and finding out how difficult that is. But he's got the depth there too. He has a different personality than Lauren that doesn't interact with the public nearly as easily as hers does. But yeah, it's there. And I will always be grateful that the 2 of them responded that way instead of the way I've seen other siblings respond. Now, one thing that I give Jalen full credit for is that at a fairly early time, I think Lauren was maybe only 8 or 9, and Chad is 3 years older than Lauren. Every year, Jalen would take the 2 of them on an international trip. I would be with Madison waiting for the T-shirt that never came. And so their passports have 3 times as many stamps as mine. But that was their payoff for all the sacrifices they were making during the year because of Madison. And that also helped enormously to shape their worldview. And when you got a 9 or 10-year-old who has been to some of the hot spots in the world and seen the grittiness of what's out there, that registers.
Wakes him up.
Yep.
I want to kind of branch now into your faith development. And I'm wondering, and I don't want to just impose this, I'm wondering if your experiences with Madison at all influenced your beliefs, your questions regarding the church. But whether or not it did, let's jump to, at what point did you sort of, number one, start really thinking differently about your faith and about the church? And then how did that parlay into wanting to write that first book on priesthood? And was there ever a faith crisis in there?
No. And that was a question that Helen Whitney asked me. I got pulled into her documentary on the Mormons because at the time she was in production, the McKay book was in press. Fred Esplin at the University of Utah had worked at PBS. So unbeknownst to me, he sent her a copy of the galley proofs. And then he called me. By the way, he and Jalyn used to date. Go figure. And said, you'll probably be getting a call from this producer in New York. She's working on a documentary on the church. And I did get the call, and that call lasted for about 3 hours. Over the next 2 years, Helen and I spent a lot of time together, mostly over the phone, but sometimes in person. And along the way, towards the end, she said, okay, I've interviewed hundreds of Mormons, and they all have had faith crises. What's yours? And I said, I'm kind of boring, because I can't recall that I ever had one. And I will still stick to that. It's not that it's been a seamless life for me. There have been a lot of bumps in the road. There have been a lot of roadblocks. But I've never sensed that I was in a faith crisis. Now, one of the things that I think helped in that regard came about because Tony Hutchinson dropped into my life. Another one of those things that you can't script. Tony has, I think, the sharpest theological mind that I've ever seen within Mormonism. He got bachelor's and master's degrees at BYU in classical studies, and then decided he wanted to do biblical studies. And credit to whoever it was, one of his professors at BYU said, then go to Catholic University because they have the best biblical studies program in the country. And he did. Well, there was a 1-year period where one night every week, Tony would drive from Catholic University to my house, which then was in Bethesda. Lester Bush would drive home from Virginia to my house, because both of them then were driving north to their homes. We'd have dinner one night a week and sit around for 2 or 3 hours talking mostly about what Tony was learning in his biblical studies. His mentor was Joseph Fitzmyer, who I think is still regarded as probably the best authority in the world on the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, which were written by the same author. So Tony was telling us on a week-by-week basis, here's what I'm learning in school today. And it was just amazing to us. We'd never heard this stuff, of how biblical studies had advanced and what the tools were. And what Tony then started to do was to take those tools he'd learned in biblical studies and move a few degrees and apply them to Mormon studies in a way that most people haven't even figured out yet.
Now, was this before you had written the Priesthood book?
Oh yeah, this was years before.
And tell us a bit about Lester Bush. He's pretty famous for...
Yeah. Lester in 1973 published an article in Dialogue on blacks and priesthood that changed the church. We wondered for years, what was the effect of that on the church, particularly on President Kimball?
Talk just a couple examples of what the article revealed about.
The most important thing was that it showed through meticulous research that went where nobody had gone before. This was never a revelation, that it was a policy, and that it was a policy that began after the death of Joseph Smith. That there were, in fact, blacks who were ordained to the priesthood while Joseph Smith was alive, was with full knowledge. Those were the main findings there. Years later, in fact, in 2009, one of my friends hosted a couple from Salt Lake for the first Obama inaugural. And that couple included Jordan Kimball, Spencer's grandson. And Brent said, Jordan, I've always wondered about the effect that article had. And he said, you don't need to wonder. He said, after my grandfather's death, I was in my father's basement and found my grandfather's copy of that issue of Dialogue.
This is Spencer B. Kimball.
He said, my grandfather would always have a red pencil in his hand when he read, and he would underline things, he would write in the margins. He said, virtually that entire article was highlighted.
So the idea is it's published in 73, and then
5 years later,
Kimball reads it, and that contributed to the...
Yes, by no means was it the only thing, no. But it was an important piece of that puzzle. We moved back to Maryland, bought a house, had no idea what the community was, and found out that's the same ward as Lester Bush. So Lester became, in 1975, my closest friend, and probably still is, 40 plus years later. So here's Lester bringing that sophistication, being a physician with no training in history, who writes an article on history that changes a church.
Didn't he work for the CIA or something like that, or FBI, or
I've heard that.
something to that effect? As a physician and a historian, right?
Not as a historian.
No, I'm saying he was all those
He
things.
was, yes.
Real briefly, what happened to Lester in the church? Was he treated well? His activity?
No, he was shunned.
Shunned by
in general.
By ward members?
I think that I think this is having a happier conclusion than we might have thought. That there's rapprochement going on there. I'm very pleased with that.
But for at least several decades, he what?
Just quietly backed away.
Because he felt mistreated?
I think you'd have to ask him specifically on
I'd love to.
But certainly he was shunned. And that was most unfortunate. And I tried to do what I could, which was not much, to rectify it, and it didn't happen. But, you know, that was right along the lines of what I'd seen with Juanita Brooks. Juanita was shunned. And I came to realize, if you're going to do things that make a difference, particularly in this church, don't expect to get accolades for it. Because you're probably going to upset somebody's apple cart, and they're not going to be real happy about that. So you keep your eyes focused on what's the right thing to do, not is somebody going to like me for doing it. And that's where Lester was and is, and that's where Juanita was. And I don't think that they have any misgivings about what their life ended up being. But anyway, Lester and Tony and I would get together. This is where we started thrashing through all of the key issues that people are still angst-ridden over today. We were talking about these 30 years ago and knew what the stakes were. In some cases, Lester was able to commission researchers to do a story on this or that because we knew how important those were. One of the things that Tony made me aware of is a book written by an American who grew up in a missionary family in China. His name is Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And the book is called Faith and Belief. Because he grew up around Eastern religions, he had a very clear understanding of the difference between East and West. And the whole point of his book is Western religions muddy the water. If you want to see what faith really is, look east. He says, the Eastern religions imbue intense faith in their community of believers, but they don't have a belief system. You don't have to sign off on articles of faith or a catechism if you're a Buddhist. And yet, Buddhists often have enormous faith. So he says, what is faith? And he says it has nothing to do with a belief system. It has to do, one synonym would be surrender. Your willingness to acknowledge the existence of a higher power and willingness to surrender your life course to whatever that power is, if that works. And that made a profound impression on me. And I saw that for Western religions, and indeed we do mix those two up, we confuse faith as, okay, I believe this, therefore I have faith, and it has very little to do with it. And maybe that's why I didn't have that faith crisis that so many others have had, because as I have looked deeply into faith crisis, and you and I have been in that boat together, going back to that magnificent online survey that preceded the meetings with Hans Mattson, so many people have experienced a faith crisis because one point of their belief system came unglued. And we quantified that. I think if they had been able to realize what faith isn't, they may not have had the crisis.
Yeah.
That's a long answer to your question, but that's
no,
where
I mean, that's
am.
important to your story, and I think a lot of people are going to find value in that. And I agree. I find a lot of value now in Buddhism and in Eastern religions and philosophies. I think there's just so much truth there. And you can even find that reflected in the New Testament and in the Book of Mormon if you're looking for it. But what you just described isn't particularly Mormon, because I think what Mormonism and Joseph Smith held out is some of its distinguishing features is this is what God is, this is what you are to believe, this is what the doctrine is, this is what sets us apart. And so you're basically saying faith is attached to this sort of belief in a higher power, and the details kind of don't really matter. But Mormonism's hallmark is sort of saying, no, the details matter, and here's what the details are, down to saying God has 10 fingers and 10 toes. And
Let's pursue that a little bit. Now, how much of that still reflects what Joseph Smith intended is something we could debate at a later time. To me, any religious leader, including Joseph Smith, is judged in terms of how effective he or she is. I think on the basis of two things. One is, does that person have the vision? With a big V. In other words, has there been some type of unusual contact between that individual and deity that makes this relationship different? And number two, can that religious leader give the community of believers access to that vision? That's it. Joseph Smith was extraordinary, I think, on both counts. That you can either believe or not believe if he actually had these visionary experiences, but certainly the historical record is fully consistent with that. And from a very early date. People will argue, well, he didn't name the angel until 1835. Yeah, but he was talking, and it was printed in newspapers in 1830, that he was having converse with angels. So don't say that he just started to make up the visionary stuff later. Yes, the story was evolving then into a historical narrative, but it started as an intensely theological event. But his real genius, because there were other religious figures at the time who were having similar visionary experiences, but they didn't launch these organizations that have endured, was his ability to put together a set of symbols that allowed the believers to have access to that vision, period. That's how I would sum up Mormonism.
a set of symbols that provide access to...
That gave them access to the vision that became then part of what they were. That explains to me why these people who otherwise were sane, including my own ancestors, would accept a call to go down to St. George and almost die down there, but somehow make it work. It wouldn't have made sense except they were able to have access to that same vision through the symbols that he appropriated so that it became part of them. Helen Whitney told me right at the end, she said, I've interviewed 800 Mormons on this. And she said, you have a good religion, but you don't own it.
You don't what?
You don't own it. She said, your people borrow it. They need to own it. I know exactly what she means. And those people did own it. So we confuse those symbols for the message. The symbols are just the conduit to get to the message. And those symbols can be statements of belief, they can be visual symbols, they can be canon, whatever. We stumble over those things when they don't exactly comport to the worldview that we have formulated. People get absolutely unglued if they perceive any threat to a non-historical Book of Mormon. You deal with this all of the time. It's a hill they're willing to die on. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's a stupid battle. You missed the whole point. So I'll take exception with what you said about Joseph Smith and the beliefs. I think what he was doing, and probably with pretty good knowledge of it, was figuring out, through trial and error often, What's going to work with this community to convey my vision to them so that it becomes part of theirs? And he was extraordinarily successful at that. Now,
and what's the central message?
the central message is to touch the face of God.
What does that mean?
That means that you have somehow access to the divine, to the infinite. What does it mean? That's as difficult a question to answer as we have. That's what he wrestled with. How do I take the infinite and convert that into the finite? And the answer is you can't. Now, a trivial example of this is when we sit in a testimony meeting. The people who are getting up at the podium are trying to impart to the congregation their own vision, unless it's a travelogue. They're trying to say, this happened to me, but the only way I can share it with you is through these clumsy verbal symbols. But if you're on board, maybe you can pick up a little bit. And I think most Mormons have experienced that they'll sit in those meetings and occasionally that connection is made. And you're feeling something that person at the podium is trying to convey verbally, but it can't be conveyed verbally alone. This is what Joseph Smith was trying to do and what he did extraordinarily well. He allowed his community of believers to touch the face of God. It didn't matter, it doesn't matter to me, what that face looks like. It doesn't matter that in his telling of visionary accounts, the story changed. I got no problem with that, largely because of what Tony taught me about what biblical studies say about it. It's history becoming theology. Once it's launched into theological realm, don't try to hold them to historical criteria, because something else has already happened there. But we get hung up on that all of the time, and I just shake my head and think, where are we going? You guys are missing the point on all of this.
You're referring to people who leave the church.
Even those who stay in, but stay in at the cost of trying to convince everybody else that there's only one way to understand all of this, and it's extreme orthodoxy. That to me is as damaging as the people who leave.
So I really want to dive into this discussion, but I'm going to hold off because there are a couple things we have to talk about first. But it's a really important part of your story because it obviously is what allowed you to remain engaged for as long as you have, and it's got to feed into why you wrote that first book. So I'm not going to.
Let me just interject here that
I'm going to come back to this discussion. So hold on.
Having read the 40,000 pages of the David O. McKay diaries and the 20,000 pages of the Leonard Arrington diaries, my response is, so what'd you expect? Because by that point, I'd come to realize how these things can be and should be sorted out. If you see people behaving badly, why would you be surprised? People behave badly, and sometimes they behave well. And when they behave well, we are the beneficiaries of it. And when they don't, then we suffer. But we don't do ourselves justice by saying they never behave badly. All right.
Okay, we're going to come back. So really quickly, we don't have time to dig too much in. Why did you write that first book on the priesthood? What was its title? What were you trying to do with that book?
The title was Power from on High, The Development of Mormon Priesthood.
And just in a sentence, what were you trying to say with that book?
In one sentence?
Or two. 3 at the most.
That book derived from my having been an Elders Quorum president. That's the whole cause of it.
It was that traumatic, you had to write a book.
Well, I was in the saddle for 4 years. That's highly unusual for Elders Quorum presidents. They tend to get shot out of the saddle after about a year. But the longer I was in it, the less satisfied I was that I really understood priesthood. Now, I had started building a library as a senior dental student. I taught early morning seminary for my last year of dental school. And at that time, that was a paying job. I was paid $600 for the whole year. But since I was living at home, finishing dental school, I thought, well, I'll just take that money and start to buy some books, because the only book that I owned was the Standard Works. And then I became aware of out-of-print books and just kept going. So that now my library is probably 11,000 volumes. But at the time I was Elders Quorum president, it was maybe 2,000 or 3,000. And so I started to read everything that I had that related to priesthood. John Whitsow's Priesthood and Church Government being high on the list. And I was very disappointed in that because it was just a scrapbook. There was really no analytical element to it. And it wasn't answering the questions that I had about priesthood, about what it is, how it happened, how it functions. And after spending several fruitless years trying to find it in published materials, I finally decided the reason I hadn't found it is it wasn't there. I was hoping that the professional historians, which at that time was Leonard Arrington, this was the late 70s, would do the job. What I didn't realize is that his division was already being disassembled at that time. I didn't really realize that until I became his biographer. But in the midst of the disassembly, priesthood was one of the topics that they were not allowed to delve into. They couldn't talk about Mountain Meadows Massacre, they couldn't talk about polygamy, they couldn't talk about priesthood in any in-depth sense, and so that's why it wasn't getting done. So I was Elders Quorum president until 1981. I started work on the priesthood book in 87. So there's a 6-year window there, and I was doing a lot of grumbling and wondering. But I also had this role model, Lester Bush, who hadn't had training but had written something that changed the whole church. I wasn't trying to change the church. I was just trying to figure this out for myself, and if I was going to that much work, I could at least write it down, and somebody else, if they wanted, could read about it.
What were 2 or 3 of the main questions you were asking with the book?
I wasn't clear what priesthood was all about. I'd heard the trivial definitions of it, but I didn't know what that meant. It turns out one of the trivial definitions is actually spot on, but people don't realize it. Power and authority to act in the name of God. But they don't know that those 2 words actually are very different from each other and what those relate to.
Power and authority.
Yes. Yes.
Authority is about keys, is that right? And power is actual ability to make things happen? Is that
to draw on the powers of heaven? Yeah. Yeah. And they're very different, and they were not part of the package initially. What I started to do was what Tony had taught me, and that was if you're analyzing a body of scripture, that what you want to do is go through earlier renditions of it and then put things in parallel columns and read across and see if there's been development. So I did that with the Doctrine and Covenants. I made my own mini Doctrine and Covenants and took all of the manuscript and published versions up through 1835, because that's when it stopped developing, and then put them in the computer in parallel vertical columns and started to read across, and the answers started to jump off the page. If you read the current Doctrine and Covenants, you don't have any idea that some of those sections were compiled over several years with several different formulations. And you just look at the date that's in the introduction and assume that's when things happen, you'll never get there. So I went back to the beginning, went to primary documents, put everything in a database on the basis of when it was written, not when it's writing about. And that was the key. Nobody had done that before. This is why B.H. Roberts, in the History of the Church that he edited, has a footnote that goes on for several pages trying to explain why the Joseph Smith history would say that the June 1831 conference in Kirtland was the first time that the Melchizedek priesthood had been revealed. And everybody else is saying, well, wait a minute, that was 1829. And the answer, class, is neither. The term Melchizedek priesthood didn't exist till 1835. Everybody took a later term and applied it uncritically on earlier events where it didn't fit. And then we got stuck with that nomenclature. So what I did was just to ignore all of the secondary history, go back to the primary documents, put everything down in chronological order of when it was written, and then read forward. And once I did that, the story fell into place. Didn't have to hide any balls, didn't have to apologize for anything.
Well, a lot of people, that's a real sticking point for them, that I guess in their mind, Joseph made it up afterwards and then tried to retrofit it. Like when people have a problem with the restoration and when things happened, isn't the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood a real problem for people? Because there's no date, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the fact that he is not naming names early on and he is later.
So they think he's kind of making it up like the first vision's growing, right?
Yeah, I wish they would sit down with a biblical scholar and get schooled, because that's part of the historical precedent becoming a theological narrative. And whatever we have now, even though it's couched in historical language, tends to be a later theological embellishment of an earlier historical event. Now, we don't have access to the original events. The first vision, date it when you want, 1820, 1823, you know the controversy about that. Nonetheless, the very first account of it is actually hidden in plain sight. It's in section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants, verses 4 and 5. But until you compare that to the 1831 account that was in the early church history, you don't realize, hey, he's saying the same thing in fewer words here. But even that earliest account is a decade after when we think the original historical event occurred. If there was this much change from 1831 to 1838, then how much change would there be between 1831 and whatever the original incident was? And the answer is we have no clue. We'll never have access to what the historical event was or what he was saying about it at an earlier date. So you deal with what you've got and make the best of it there.
But for you, the fact that it's changing, either the story of the first vision or the story of the Melchizedek priesthood, you don't care because that's sort of unknowable historical facts that inform an eventual theology, and it's really the theology that matters, not the historical facts.
Oh, I care a lot about it because looking at the evolution of it teaches you a lot about how this process happens. It starts to...
But for you, it's not a sign of fraud.
No.
Or why not?
No. Let me give you an example out of the Bible. Now, in this case, we're talking about multiple writers instead of Joseph Smith's first vision with one writer writing multiple versions. If you line up the books of the New Testament that speak directly of Jesus, basically you've got 5. You lump the Pauline epistles together, and those are the earliest, so we'll put them first in our timeline here. Then you put Mark. So Paul writing in the 50s, Mark in the 60s, Matthew and Luke writing at the same time in about the 70s, and then John sometime later, 80s, 90s, whatever.
So and it wasn't really Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was,
of course not.
After they were dead, oral tradition, people writing down what they had heard he said.
Yeah, Robert's the pirate.
What's that?
Robert's the pirate.
Right.
Princess Bride.
Yeah.
Yeah. The same way that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. But it honors him by putting his name on the book. All right. But we know that it was different authors, and we know the timing of it with fairly high precision. So let's look chronologically at what these guys did with what's called Christology. Christology meaning, what was it that transformed Jesus from us to not us? That he became divine, that he was different, okay? So what does Paul say about it? Well, Paul says nothing about the mortal Jesus. And yet he was the closest chronologically to whatever that was. So he would still have been hearing the oral stories going around. He put nothing of that in there. Why? Because for him, the whole message of Jesus was Christ crucified. And it was the crucifixion and the resurrection that made him God. Okay, now the next one's Mark. How does the Gospel of Mark begin? He goes down to Jordan to be baptized. He's an adult. It says not one word about him as an infant or a child. And what happens after the baptism? Voice from the heaven, the dove comes down. This guy's different. This doesn't happen to the other people who are being baptized. Now, the next two right at the same time, and that's Matthew and Luke. And how does their gospel begin? Well, we talk about it every Christmas. And we throw those two together and we make this mishmash that doesn't make any sense because it's not the same story. Several of the details are quite different. They're taking oral traditions and writing them down in their own gospel, but the thing on which they agree is the Christological event is the birth. That's where the miracles happened. And then the last one to write is John. And what does John say? In the beginning was the Word with God, and the Word was God. And then he came.
So they're filling in.
The theology is advancing. Which one of those four possibilities is right? Because only one of them can be. He doesn't become divine more than once. What's the starting point for that? There's only one starting point. And the answer is, take your pick. On a historical basis, who knows? But on a theological basis, what you're seeing is the evolution of the theology. So who's telling the truth? It's possible that all five of them are telling the truth. It's possible that none of them is telling the truth in terms of any historical event. We don't know. That's what our people have a difficult time trying to crack into. And I just want to scream at them occasionally and say, don't you guys get it? Why are you fighting these fights that have no meaning at all? You're missing the point entirely. When Hans Mattson's story broke in the New York Times and sent a shockwave across the country that you felt out here, it elicited a letter to the editor about 3 days later from Harold Kushner, Jewish rabbi who wrote the book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he wrote that because he had a son with progeria, which is the accelerated maturation, and they die when they're in their teens, die of old age. And so, how does he grapple with that? And that was why he wrote that book. But he wrote this letter to the Times, and it was a beautiful, brief letter. He said, I have read the story of Hans Mattson, and I would hope that the Mormons could learn from the Jewish experience of distinguishing literal scripture from allegorical scripture. And he was right, but we don't get that. The class average among Mormons is it's all literal. And that's only going to get you into a mess that you'll never get out of. It's time to grow up.
We come by it honestly. Right? You write about it in your book. That's how CES evolved.
Well, and I think that the genesis of it may go back to the teens. Somebody needs to do a better job than I've done on that. But in the first decade of the 20th century, there was an existential-sized challenge to Christianity because of the development of biblical scholarship. Some called it higher criticism, and it's where, frankly, the tools of science were brought to the forefront and applied to biblical scholarship. Scientific methodology is pervasive in this world. Most people don't understand that. Even literary criticism borrows those tools of science and then goes off in a different direction. But that's when it started to kick in full speed in biblical scholarship, and it scared the hell out of people, including our people out here. You know the story of the Peterson brothers and the Chamberlain brothers, both pairs were fired from BYU at that time over that issue. They wouldn't budge on organic evolution, and that was part of this package because biblical criticism was attacking the creation stories as allegory. And the religionists were saying, no, that's exactly the way it happened. So I think that the church response to that, particularly the church president, Joseph F. Smith, he was so shaken by that his response was to go the fundamentalist route. And he wrote a book that was published shortly after his death, Gospel Doctrine, that became, I think, the first real book that formalized Mormon fundamentalism and almost canonized it because he'd been the church president. And then that baton was passed to his son and then to his grandson-in-law.
Bruce R. McConkie.
and so you have a period of nearly a century where that is the central school of thought within Mormonism, it is so deeply embedded that it's going to take a long time for other alternatives to start to compete. I think we're going down that road now. The fact that McConkie's book was taken out of print several years ago is a sign that there is a shift. The fact that if you look at some of the materials that have been published lately that are reprints of earlier ones that have taken out bibliographic references to to Mormon doctrine, you see, yeah, they get it. They realize they got to start dismantling what had been constructed before. But the construction a century ago made sense. They thought they were in a battle to the death with the biblical scholars, not realizing that in fact that biblical scholarship would take the entire field to a higher and much firmer plateau, which is where I think Mormonism will get if we ever stop holding ourselves back.
Did you get any pushback about your priesthood book? Any concerns, any ruffled feathers?
Those are different questions. Did I get pushback? No. Were there ruffled feathers? Yes. Now, I don't know exactly whose were ruffled, but a little over a year after that book came out, so this would have been, I think, the December 1996 issue of the Ensign. Larry Porter, down at BYU, wrote what I think is the longest article ever published in the Ensign. And it was on priesthood restoration. A couple of months after that came out, I was in a setting where I was able to have a lengthy, really candid discussion with a general authority. And I said, Larry Porter's article sounded to me like the church is saying in a loud voice, Prince and his book don't exist. And he started to laugh, and he says, you're a lot closer to the truth than you might think. So yeah, it shook him.
What was their concern with your book?
Well, they never talked about it, so I don't know. I'd have to triangulate to it. Well, he was tabbed by them to write the orthodoxy in a louder voice.
Was there a point or two?
He never mentioned the book existed.
No, of course, they don't do that. But was there a point or two he was trying to make in the article to respond to your book?
No, he was not responding.
He was trying to lay a different narrative.
He was trying to restate the orthodoxy so that everybody got the right message.
Okay.
Now, what was the violence that my book did? I don't think it did any violence. What it did was to put this thing into perspective that finally people could understand. Namely, hey, Revelation is incremental. It's line upon line. We've heard that one before, but we don't believe it.
Yeah.
That it's evolutionary.
Yeah.
And then getting back to that issue of authority versus power. The authority was there from the earliest time, 1829. And it was that quest for religious authority that drove Joseph and Oliver to do what they did. Think of all of the ordinances that you've ever participated in, witnessed in your life. How many of them invoke the priesthood authority of the officiator?
All of them?
Almost.
So the baby blessing, which isn't really an ordinance, but the baptism.
That's an ordinance. Remember, the real definition of ordinance, which is another thing that the book did, an ordinance is something that we call an ordinance. It's the best definition, because some things that look like ordinances we haven't chosen to call ordinances, and some things that we used to call ordinances we don't call them anymore, and some things that we didn't now are ordinances.
It's a fungible term.
And if you want your Trivial Pursuit question, what's the most recent ordinance in the church? And the answer is 1976, the dedication of graves, which in prior iterations of the General Handbook, if you go back far enough, says this is not an ordinance, and it doesn't matter who does it. And then later it says, well, it's not an ordinance, but it should be somebody with the priesthood. And then finally in 1970, this is a priesthood ordinance. So It's a circular definition, but it's the only one that fits. There are three that don't invoke priesthood, and they all predate 1831, which is a crucial date.
So baptism, confirmation, what?
Because we don't have prescribed prayer for confirmation. And the only reason these three are, they were canonical before the church got going. They're all in the Book of Mormon and in the Book of Commandments.
What else?
Two sacramental prayers.
Ah, right.
The P word is not in any of those.
Because it evolved later.
Yeah, they didn't use the word priesthood for the first 2 years. And then it didn't mean what it later meant. They didn't use the terms Aaronic priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood until 1835. But that didn't just mean something that you could retroactively apply 5 or 6 years earlier.
And someone's going to say Joseph's making this up and making it up as he goes along. For them, that's going to be a concern. For you, you're just saying, of course he's making it up as he goes along.
He's giving it flesh as he goes along. Yeah, if you call that making it up, all right, he made it up. But he didn't make up the essence. He was working on the form of it, but the essence was there from the beginning. Now, what's the other half of that equation? The power. This wasn't on their radar initially. In the fall of 1830...
And when you say power to heal sick people...
Yeah, they didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
All right. Fall of 1830, 4 missionaries go west. Oliver Cowdery is one of them. Parley Pratt's one of them. Ziba Peterson and one of the Whitmers. They stop in Kirtland. Pratt was from a congregation that was headed by Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon gets converted. 4 missionaries go out to Missouri. Rigdon and one of his parishioners, Edward Partridge, go east. And within 3 weeks of when he meets Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon is the scribe for what became Section 38. Go to the Ohio, and there you'll be endowed with power from on high. Rigdon split with Alexander Campbell over the issue of gifts of the Spirit. Campbell said that was fine in ancient times. It has no part in the modern church, even though we are the primitive church, the disciples of Christ. Rigdon said, no, it's essential. It's one of the signs of the true church. That's why they split. That's why Rigdon joined up with the Mormons, because he sensed something there that played to his own biases. Now he's weighing in with Joseph Smith. And what he's doing is just pulling out of Luke 24, where the disciples meet with the resurrected Christ, and he says, go out and convert the world. But you can't do it yet. Tarry at Jerusalem until you're endowed with power from on high. Now, understand that Luke and Acts are the same author. So read 2 chapters beyond that, you're into the 2nd chapter of Acts. Day of Pentecost. That's when they received the power. Then they were enabled to go out and preach the gospel to all the world. So Rigdon brought that second part of the equation to Joseph Smith. And that endowment of power from on high is the attempt to gain access to that portal up there, whatever it is. And that's what makes the difference. There was a 1931 article in the Improvement Era, written under the direction of the Quorum of the 12, that says, why priesthood at all, ? Look it up sometime. I've talked to the historians in the church history department. They've never noticed it. And basically what it says is, all right, is it possible that people who don't hold the priesthood would be able to tie into divine power, have their prayers answered, to heal people, whatever? And the answer is yes. So what's priesthood? Well, it's an administrative thing. It's like having authorization as a government official to perform a function.
Keys.
It was very telling there, because at that time, if you go back and look at the priesthood manuals written around that article, they're trying to get quorums to function. They're looking at mechanics. So they're focused on keys, on authorization to do this. Now, if you are authorized to perform an ordinance, it doesn't matter if you're a rat. You may have committed adultery the night before. You perform a baptism the next day. The church will not require that person to be rebaptized, even though you clearly were unworthy, but you were still authorized. If you go to a cancer patient and promise a restoration of full health, you better have more than authority going for you, or it isn't even going to pierce the ceiling. And that happens way too often. That's the difference. And so what they were looking for is, how do we tie into that divine power? And it's a question that we still grapple with all of the time, because it's not automatic. The authority is. How do we do that? They accessed it initially through that June 1831 conference in the schoolhouse in Kirtland. That was a Pentecost. You can read the accounts. I had probably 80 pages of first-hand accounts that I compiled of that. And it looks very much like what Acts chapter 2 is describing. But that's where the idea of endowment began, and it's an unbroken pathway from that to the present time. A lot of other things have been brought into that, like buildings that we call temples. That's 1831, folks. 1830, actually, when that revelation was given. We didn't have a building for another 6 years. And then the temple ceremony shifted dramatically when they got to Nauvoo and got other ordinances performed in there. But if you look going from June 1831 to the present, there's that unbroken line, and that's the last thing that we do before we send a missionary out. That man or that woman goes to the temple for that endowment. Most of them don't have a clue what that's really all about. And I doubt that any of them could trace that pedigree back to what Rigdon and Smith were talking about in 1831. But you put those two together, that's the complete package that should be priesthood, but it doesn't function that way nearly as often as it should. So those kinds of concepts were laid out in great detail in that book, but for some reason that shook them. Go figure.
We won't dig into the David O. McKay book here. The only thing I'll ask is, we'll refer you to episode 2 of Mormon Stories to learn about that book and the book itself. I've had people come to me and say that that book was the beginning of their faith crisis. Have you ever heard that, and what would your reaction be?
I haven't heard that directly from any. I haven't even heard it indirectly from people.
What?
No, haven't.
Never?
No.
Oh.
Maybe they're just being kind to me.
I guess that's not a fun thing to tell somebody. I hear it all the time, of course.
It's the same dilemma that the church has faced with the church history essays. That it's one thing to be able to write it, and even that is a difficult thing because they're addressing multiple constituencies with a single document. But then how do you deploy that in such a way that you're answering the questions of this group without knocking over this group? And the answer is, you run a risk that some people will read it and get unhinged. Is it the fault of the document? If the document is telling untruths, then I think that there is a fiduciary responsibility that goes back to the author. If the document is firmly grounded in truth, then I think you better look at a different direction if you want to point fingers of blame. So if that was the beginning of their faith crisis, I'm sorry that they would have a faith crisis at all. But they were having it because nothing had prepared them for the, frankly, well-known truths that are in that book.
So it's kind of the church's fault, not yours.
I'm not pointing fingers.
One last question for this segment. Did you ever consider trying to invoke the power of the priesthood to heal your son Madison? Or did anyone ever suggest that?
Yes. And we have never had a prompting in so doing that there was to be a healing in the sense of making him what his siblings are. It's not been there. And I'm comfortable with that. I wish it were otherwise. I wish I could flip that switch. I have been witness, not in the field of autism, but in other circumstances where well-intentioned holders of the priesthood made promises that didn't have a chance of happening. And those can be extremely destructive. If somebody gets unhinged by reading the McKay book, I'm sorry it happens, but I'm not apologizing for just having written the truth about some very important things. If somebody gets unhinged because a priesthood holder has given that person a blessing that was vacated on the spot, then I think that's a real problem. And if I had been the one pronouncing that blessing, I would consider it a real problem on my part.
And you never felt the impulse to try?
We have given him blessings, but the message never was there that, okay, suddenly this is going to flip and he'll be neurotypical and life goes on without any bumps. It's not for lack of hope, it's not for lack of trying, it's that there's a reality there that we don't have the capability of changing. Best efforts notwithstanding.
So some would ask, what is that power? What's the, you talk about having things be real and relevant and practical. You could probably take all the priesthood blessings ever given to heal, and either they would have gotten better or worse anyway, and any getting better, and a bunch of them probably didn't come to pass. We've interviewed several people on Mormon Stories where they were blessed to be healed from cancer or whatever, and they died, So a bunch that didn't work, and then a bunch that hedged and said, whatever God's will, right? But the number where actual healings took place, that you couldn't just sort of say were either misdiagnoses or just the luck of the draw of what would have happened anyway without the blessing, you probably get down to very, very few where actually it's sort of a credible claim that significant healing took place. And one way to really say that quickly is you don't ever see someone who's an amputee getting healed, right? Maybe cancer goes into remission, but cancer goes into remission without priesthood blessings. So you don't, the real significant ones never get better. And so the ones that are questionable, it's either it's a test and that's why they died, or, oh, it's a miracle, God healed them, but they may have been healed anyway. So I guess the way that we'll end this episode is, what is the practical reality of that power for you? Is it real? And has it ever been real in your life?
Yes, but it...
And is it anywhere near what we think it is?
On a good day, yes. And this is where we get confused, because sometimes we're not having the good day, and sometimes it's not in the cards. This was brought up to President McKay, and he's got a diary entry about it, that his son, I think it was Robert, was going to a fireside, and he said, I got to tell you, Father, that there's a person there whose spouse or whatever you gave a blessing to, who died. What am I to say? That's a very tough dilemma. And I've seen several instances looking at earlier church records, particularly diaries, where people who sat at a very high level in the church were continually giving the blessings, hoping, promising, and it didn't happen. And those are people who tied into things I'll never tie into. So I think there is an element to it that sometimes it isn't God's will, but I think there's a zone that we tend not to inhabit. Some people will couch everything in qualifiers that render it meaningless. If this be thy will. Well, why are you bothering to do it then? Say something or go home. And I feel very strongly that way about some of the things that I've seen. But there's that zone in there where that human intervention tying into whatever that conduit is moves it from here to here. And I have seen that. I'll give you one example.
Do you believe in that?
Yeah. I don't see it enough, but yes, I do. I'll give you an example, and it's a name you're probably familiar with, Andrew Hamilton. All right? Never met Andrew. I grew up with his father. His grandfather, his namesake, was never a church member. Andrew's grandmother was a very, very staunch church member. While I was in dental school, Andrew, the grandfather, had a very severe heart attack. He was the director of public relations at UCLA and had a stellar career there. So he was in the UCLA hospital. Well, UCLA hospital is just down the hall from where I was going to dental school. So my father, who was then the bishop, had gone over with another member of the ward and had given Andrew a blessing. And I was just going over the next day to say hello to him. And I walked in, and he recognized me, and he started talking. He said, 2 men from your church came here yesterday. He didn't realize my father had been one of them. And he said, they did something, some rite, and I didn't really understand what it was. But he said, as soon as they did that, I knew that I was going to be healed. He said, I knew I'd walk out of here. Now, this was an agnostic, and he didn't know what it was. But he articulated that without any prompting from me and said, until then, I thought I was going to die. Yeah, when you've seen things like that, when I've seen things like that, then I know there's something there, but I also realize it's something that is tapped into with difficulty and infrequently and much less frequent than we would hope. But there is something there, and that's what Rigdon was so intent on putting into the equation and got into the equation. And it's still there, but it's not the automatic, and because of that, it's often inaccessible to us. Because of us, not because of it. It is rare. It is rare, yeah.
All right, brethren and sistren, we are concluding part 2 of our interview, our second interview with Greg Prince. We need to talk about his book, Leonard, Arrington, and the Writing of Mormon History. And we need to talk about current events in Mormonism and where the church is going. And I have no idea how we're going to pack that in to an hour and 20 minutes. But we're going to do our best. So thanks for joining us on Mormon Stories for this part 2. Comment on the blog at mormonstories.org if you want. And please tune in for part 3, which will be coming around in just a second. Thanks so much. Thanks, Greg.
You're welcome.